I was examining photographs of World's Fair exhibitions when I noticed the towers. Not the ornamental ones, the functional towers. Tall metal structures with spherical tops, positioned throughout fairgrounds. Official descriptions call them decorative electrical displays. But the electrical capacity doesn't match decoration. These towers were designed to transmit power, wireless power, through the air. Chicago World's Fair, 1893. The Columbian Exposition. Photographs show at least 12 major towers across the fairground, each topped with large copper spheres, thick cables running underground to central generating stations. Power output calculations in electrical journals describe capacity far exceeding what the fair's lighting required. Someone was testing something beyond illumination, something revolutionary. The engineering wasn't subtle. These were permanent structures, steel frameworks anchored in concrete foundations, copper spheres costing thousands of dollars each, extensive underground wiring connecting them to massive generators. This wasn't temporary exhibition infrastructure, this was production deployment of wireless transmission technology. Built to prove the concept, built to demonstrate to investors and government officials that wireless power distribution was viable at scale. And it worked. Accounts from electrical engineers who attended the fair describe devices operating throughout the grounds with no visible power connections. Lights that illuminated without wires. Motors that ran without cables. Demonstrations that should have been impossible according to standard electrical theory. But they were happening, witnessed by thousands, documented by technical press, verified by engineers who understood exactly what they were seeing, and then they vanished. Between 1895 and 1900, these towers were systematically dismantled, not just at fairgrounds, across cities, across continents. Structures that had been built with obvious permanence were removed with remarkable speed. The official explanation, obsolete technology, replaced by more efficient systems. But when you examine what replaced them, that explanation fails. Standard electrical grids with wired connections, less efficient, more expensive to install and maintain, requiring massive infrastructure of poles, cables, transformers, distribution centers. Why replace wireless transmission with wired distribution? The towers themselves tell a story. The design is too specific to be experimental. Base stations with resonant coils wound in precise configurations, elevated transmission spheres creating electrical fields that extended for miles, receiving stations that could power devices without physical connection. This wasn't theory. This was operational technology being deployed at scale. Look at the specifications. Wardenclyffe Tower, built by Nikola Tesla in 1901 to 1902 on Long Island, New York. Height 187 feet, top sphere 68 feet in diameter, weighing 55 tons of copper. Designed specifically to transmit electrical power wirelessly across vast distances. Tesla calculated the system could power devices anywhere on Earth through resonance with the planet's electromagnetic field. Not experimental, not theoretical. The engineering was precise, based on years of prior research. At Colorado Springs in 1899, Tesla had proven the concept. He built a transmission facility that lit 200 incandescent bulbs 25 miles away with no wires connecting them. Witnesses included reporters, engineers, and investors. The bulbs burned at full brightness, drawing power from the ambient electrical field Tesla's transmitter created. Documented repeatedly over months of testing. This wasn't magic. This was working technology. Wardenclyffe was the next step, scaled up for global transmission. Nearly operational when funding stopped in 1906. J.P. Morgan withdrew investment. Tower demolished 1917. Why destroy proven technology that was weeks away from completion? Why tear down something that could have revolutionized civilization? The pattern appears everywhere once you know to look for it. San Francisco had transmission towers operational in 1894, documented in city electrical surveys. Denver, St. Louis, London, Paris, Berlin. Cities across the world installed these structures between 1890 and 1895. And between 1895 and 1905, they were all removed. Not mothballed, demolished, the metal salvaged, the foundations destroyed. Permanent erasure of infrastructure that had been functioning successfully. The technology wasn't theoretical. Electrical journals from 1893 to 1894 describe successful wireless transmission demonstrations in technical detail. Power transmitted across distances measured in miles without wires. Devices operating from ambient electrical fields created by the transmitting towers. Lights illuminating with no visible power source. Motors running. All powered wirelessly. Journalists witnessed it and wrote detailed accounts. Engineers documented the results and published papers. Investors funded expanded deployment. This was real, working technology with commercial backing. Then it stopped. Not because it failed. The technical papers don't describe malfunction. They describe cessation. Abrupt termination. Funding withdrawn. Projects canceled. Facilities dismantled. And the explanation shifts dramatically. Suddenly, wireless power becomes impossible, inefficient, impractical. The same technology that had been proven operational in front of thousands of witnesses becomes dismissed as fantasy. Textbooks written after 1900 claim wireless power transmission is thermodynamically impossible, contradicting the demonstrations that had been publicly verified just years earlier. Who pulled the funding? Follow the money. Major investors. In wireless power transmission in 1893 to 1894, industrial magnates who controlled copper mining and electrical wire manufacturing. The same people whose business model required massive copper cable infrastructure for wired electrical distribution, whose profits depended on selling millions of miles of copper wire, thousands of wooden poles, countless transformers, and distribution equipment. They funded wireless power research initially, but once the demonstrations proved the technology worked, they had a problem. J.P. Morgan, primary financier of Tesla's Wardenclyffe project, investing over $150,000, equivalent to millions today. Also primary investor in copper mining operations through Anaconda Copper, one of the largest copper producers in the world. Also major stakeholder in electrical utilities that required wired distribution, companies that sold power through metered connections and required vast amounts of copper infrastructure. In 1906, Morgan abruptly withdrew funding from Wardenclyffe when Tesla was weeks away from completing the facility. The withdrawal wasn't due to technical failure. Tesla's system was functional. It was due to a question Morgan reportedly asked, "Where can I put the meter?" Tesla couldn't answer in a way that satisfied Morgan's business model. Wireless power transmission meant anyone with a receiving device could access power from the transmitter. No way to meter it accurately, no way to control who used how much, no way to charge per kilowatt hour. The entire infrastructure of profitable electrical distribution, the meters, the billing systems, the ability to disconnect non-paying customers, all of that becomes impossible with broadcast power. Morgan understood this, and he understood that his other investments in copper mining, in wired utilities, in electrical equipment manufacturing, all depended on the wire distribution model continuing. The conflict of interest couldn't be more obvious. Wireless power transmission would eliminate the need for extensive electrical infrastructure that generated ongoing profits. No copper cables to sell, no transmission lines to install and maintain, No distribution networks to build and operate, just transmission towers and receiving devices. Once the initial system was built, power could be distributed almost freely to anyone within range. The ongoing profit model of selling copper cable, selling electricity through metered connections, maintaining monopoly control over distribution, all of that disappears with wireless transmission, so it had to be stopped. Not because the technology didn't work, the demonstrations proved it worked. Because it worked too well. Because free or nearly free distribution of power threatened the entire business model being established for the electrical age. The same investors who could have revolutionized electrical distribution chose instead to suppress the technology and profit. From infrastructure scarcity, the world's fairs were demonstrations at massive, undeniable scale, proof of concept that couldn't be dismissed, show that wireless transmission could power hundreds of electrical devices across large areas simultaneously, demonstrate the viability to investors, government officials, and the general public in the most visible way possible. Make the technology so successful, so undeniable, that it would have to be taken seriously and deployed commercially. And it worked spectacularly. The demonstrations were successful beyond question. Power transmitted wirelessly across the fairgrounds. Devices operated reliably for months. Thousands of electrical lights illuminated the White City without visible power connections, the famous illuminations that made the Chicago Fair a nighttime spectacle. Hundreds of thousands of witnesses saw technology that should have transformed civilization within a generation. And then the towers came down. Within 5 years of the most successful demonstrations, the infrastructure was being systematically dismantled, quietly, with minimal public attention. The towers at the Chicago Fair, massive structures that had cost enormous sums to build, were removed and scrapped. The technology that had powered the most spectacular exhibition in American history became something we collectively forgot. Within a generation, wireless power was remembered as a failed experiment rather than a suppressed innovation that threatened established interests. But the photographs remain as evidence. The towers were real, captured in countless images. The transmission capability was documented in technical journals. Publications like Electrical World and Electrical Engineer recorded the demonstrations with technical specifications. The technology worked, verified by engineers and witnessed by crowds. And someone decided it couldn't continue. Someone with enough power to coordinate suppression across industries and nations made that decision. The timing connects to larger patterns. The 1890s saw massive consolidation in electrical utilities, formation of monopolies and trusts, establishment of standardized distribution models that favored centralized control by utility companies, creation of regulatory frameworks that codified this control, regulations written by the industry itself through captured regulatory bodies. All of this happened precisely when wireless transmission was being demonstrated as a viable, perhaps superior, alternative. Not coincidence. Deliberate structuring of an entire industry to exclude the technology that threatened monopolistic control. Look at the regulatory changes in detail. Before 1895, electrical distribution was relatively open and experimental. Multiple approaches coexisted, competing technologies, city-by-city experimentation. After 1900, aggressive standardization, national and international regulations explicitly favoring specific distribution methods, wired systems with metered connections, licensing requirements that excluded wireless approaches or made them prohibitively expensive, safety codes written specifically to make wireless transmission legally problematic, citing unproven dangers from electromagnetic fields, building codes that prohibited wireless receiving equipment. The entire regulatory environment was systematically reshaped to eliminate wireless competition, not for legitimate safety or efficiency reasons, but to protect business models and ensure ongoing profitability. And the alternative explanation, that wireless power simply didn't work well enough, doesn't hold up. Tesla's demonstrations were public, repeatable, and verified by independent engineers. Other engineers replicated the results. The technology was proven functional, but it couldn't be monetized the same way wired distribution could. You can't charge people for power delivered wirelessly through ambient fields the same way you charge for metered electricity through controlled physical connections. The business model didn't support it. The infrastructure for monitoring usage, controlling access, charging based on consumption, all of that requires physical connections that can be metered and controlled. With wireless transmission, once the towers are built, anyone within range with a receiving device can access power freely. No way to meter it accurately enough for billing, no way to prevent unauthorized use, no way to cut off service for non-payment. The entire apparatus of monopolistic control that generates sustained profit from electrical distribution becomes impossible. Power becomes more like air or sunlight, available freely to anyone who wants it, limited only by the capacity of the transmission infrastructure. The towers themselves suggest something deeper. Their architectural style doesn't match early 1900s industrial design. They're more ornate, more permanent, built with aesthetic sensibility that seems inherited from earlier building traditions. Look at photographs of the transmission towers at World's Fairs and city installations. The bases feature classical architectural elements, columns, arches, ornamental details that serve no electrical function, almost as if the towers were being built to match or replicate an older architectural pattern, or as if the engineers building them in the 1890s were working from templates or designs that predated the electrical age. This connects to larger questions about the infrastructure we call Tartarian, buildings across the world with unusual electrical features, structures with elaborate copper architectural elements, and grounding systems far more extensive than needed for lightning protection. Ornate metalwork on spires and domes that might have served as receiving antennas. Underground tunnel networks connecting major buildings that could have carried power. Distribution systems, all suggesting a previous era of wireless electrical distribution that our current historical narrative doesn't acknowledge. The towers built in the 1890s might not have been innovations. They might have been recreations, attempts to rediscover and deploy a technology that had existed before and been lost or suppressed in an earlier historical disruption. So, the business model won. Not the technology, not efficiency, not public benefit. The business model, technology that could have provided abundant cheap power, was suppressed in favor of systems that required ongoing payment for infrastructure and distribution. Not because of technical limitations, the technology worked and had been demonstrated successfully, because of economic ones. Because free energy, or nearly free energy after initial infrastructure costs, doesn't generate sustainable profit for investors. And the people who controlled capital decided profit mattered more than possibility, more than public benefit, more than technological progress. The towers stood as monuments to what could have been, tall structures visible across cities, rising above buildings, physical proof that wireless transmission worked, tangible evidence of a technological path not taken, and then they were removed, systematically, globally, coordinated across nations and industries. The physical evidence eliminated with remarkable thoroughness. The technology suppressed through financial pressure, regulatory capture, and institutional control. The knowledge allowed to fade as the generation that had witnessed the working demonstrations died off. And the official history rewritten to present wired distribution as the only viable option, rather than acknowledging it as simply the most profitable one for those who controlled capital. What we're left with is fragments scattered across archives, photographs of towers whose function is misidentified or ignored, technical papers describing successful experiments that somehow lead nowhere, that produce no commercial deployment. Patents for wireless transmission devices that were never manufactured at scale despite proven functionality. And the nagging reality that we're still using electrical distribution technology based on designs from the 1890s because the alternative, the more efficient, more accessible alternative, was deliberately suppressed over a century ago. The implications extend far beyond electricity and power distribution. If wireless power transmission was suppressed for economic reasons, to protect business models and maintain profitable scarcity, what else was stopped for similar motives? What other technologies have been demonstrated as viable, proven as functional through public testing, and then eliminated or sidelined because they threatened existing profit structures? How much innovation has been sacrificed to preserve business models? How many times has technological progress been deliberately halted because it would disrupt the revenue streams of those who control capital? The towers that came down in 1895 represent more than lost electrical technology. They represent a fundamental choice about how society would develop through the industrial age, a choice to prioritize controllable, profitable distribution over abundant, accessible power. A choice to maintain artificial scarcity rather than enable technological plenty. A choice made by people with capital to preserve their interests at the expense of broader technological possibility and public benefit. And that choice reverberates through everything that followed, not just in electrical systems, but in how innovation itself is controlled and directed by financial interests. Stand in any modern city and look carefully at the electrical infrastructure that surrounds you. Miles upon miles of cables strung between thousands of wooden or metal poles. Massive distribution networks snaking through streets and alleys and underground conduits. Transformers on every block. Substations scattered across neighborhoods. Control centers monitoring the flow. An incredibly complex, expensive system for moving electricity from generators to consumers. A system that requires constant maintenance, endless replacement of aging components, and generates continuous profit for utilities and equipment manufacturers through infrastructure dependency. All of it necessary only because wireless transmission was suppressed in 1895. All of it representing ongoing profit extraction from consumers who have no alternative. And none of it would exist, or would exist in vastly reduced form, if the towers from 1893 had been allowed to continue operating and proliferating across cities and countryside. The wireless system would have required initial investment to build the transmission towers, but after that, power distribution would have been nearly free, just the cost of generation and tower. Maintenance. No miles of copper cable to install and maintain. No distribution losses from resistance in long transmission lines. No vulnerability to storms and accidents that knock down wires. Just broadcast power available to anyone with a receiver. But they weren't allowed to proliferate. They were deliberately dismantled with remarkable speed and coordination. The technology was suppressed through financial pressure from investors who stood to lose billions in potential wired infrastructure profits. Suppressed through regulatory capture, laws and codes written by industry insiders to make wireless transmission illegal or impossibly expensive to deploy. Suppressed through academic and scientific gatekeeping that redefined wireless power as impossible despite successful demonstrations. The possibility was erased through comprehensive institutional control across finance, government, education, and industry. And we're left with the question that haunts every photograph of those towers. What would our world look like if free energy hadn't ended in 1895? If the wireless power towers had been allowed to proliferate across cities, countryside, and eventually globally as Tesla envisioned, if abundance had won over artificial scarcity, if technological possibility had been prioritized over business model preservation and profit extraction, would we have seen an earlier transformation to electrical transportation without the range limitations of batteries and with no need for charging infrastructure? Would rural electrification have happened decades earlier, bringing power to farms and remote areas without the massive expense of stringing wires across vast distances? Would entire industries that depend on controlled, metered power distribution have developed differently or not at all? We'll never know the answer to those questions because someone decided we shouldn't know. Someone with enough power to coordinate suppression across industries, nations, and regulatory bodies made that decision in the critical years between 1895 and 1906. And it stuck. For over a century, we've lived with the consequences of that choice. A world where electricity remains expensive, controlled, and distributed through infrastructure that enriches utilities while keeping energy artificially scarce. The towers are gone, demolished, and scrapped. The technology is dismissed as fantasy despite photographic and documentary evidence of its function. The knowledge has faded as generations passed without exposure to the working systems, and most people don't even know to ask what we lost or why it was taken from us.